As you may recall, back in 2011 and 2012, the state experienced some severe drought conditions. City staff informed council early in 2013 that if the drought continued as it were, that we would have a threatened water supply 2.5 years later, mid-2015. That started a conversation about what sorts of drought protection measures were appropriate and that the council wanted to consider. Fortunately, we had a significant rain in the summer of 2013, and it filled up Cheney Lake, which is one of our primary water supplies. But staff was directed to look at what would be an appropriate water resource plan to provide the necessary water into a planning period out to 2060. In addition to that, the city's engagement efforts, including ACT ICT and surveys that the city conducted, was conducted looking at what were the priorities of the public in terms of levels of service and spending. And in all of our efforts, water source, a reliable water source, came out as the clear winner, or the clear first priority. So we're bringing to council in their workshop following their regular meeting tomorrow some options on conservation and new water supplies for their consideration. A water resource plan really has three key elements to it. One is, what level of risk do you want to take as far as drought protection is concerned? A low risk means that you plan for very severe droughts. A higher risk means you plan for less severe droughts and hope that severe droughts don't happen. Another aspect of water resource planning is, what do you want to do as far as conservation? Conservation is a good way to reduce demand, both current and future, and how does that play into your water resource plan? And finally, the next important piece is new water supply, bringing on water that the city doesn't presently have access to. So the staff's presentation in the workshop tomorrow will be really zeroing in on these three areas. On drought protection, what we're looking at is 1% drought and a 2% drought. That's a probability measurement, one time in 100, twice in 100 years. We're also going to be showing them how the drought plan that they approved and put into action, what that would look like in both a 1% and a 2% drought, and how severe the measures would need to be in order to get through those two events, to give them some sort of a sense of what the implications of picking a 1% design drought or a 2%. Then we're going to be looking at conservation, and staff has done work on looking at the economic implications of conservation. Generally, conservation is viewed as a positive, a good thing. It's saving water. Conservation generally is, but conservation done in the wrong way can actually have negative economic impacts, and so staff has been working on looking at how to identify and characterize different types of conservation that would not have a negative impact on our water customers. And then we'll be talking about new water sources. Before we start talking about the additional water sources, we'll give them an update on the ASR project that just was finished and tested back in 2013, and give them an update and a status report on that project. Then we'll be bringing some new water supply options to them. Staff looked at literally dozens of different possible ways of getting additional water, and did a very high-level analysis looking at both the yield and the cost of those different alternatives, and we brought it down to a final list of 9. We'll be bringing those 9 options to council, and with a recommendation that we look even harder, do even more refinement on 5 of those 9 that look best from a capital to yield perspective, and we'll be presenting more detailed information to council on those 5. What we'd hope for is for council to have the information that they need to make decisions in future meetings on what level of drought that they would like to plan for, what kind of conservation would they like to have, and what kind of new water source would they like to bring on, understanding that conservation and the new water source have to work together to get through the design drought that they're looking to protect themselves from. So that's what we'll be presenting to council at Tuesday's meeting. At this point, I'd be open to any questions.
What's the water situation currently? Obviously, last year we were looking still at the drought before the whole significant rain came about. Give us an update on how it is now.
We're close to 100% full. It varies a little bit from week to week. What we're finding is that we are getting some flow into the reservoir, and what we've been doing is working with the Army Corps of Engineers to allow water that normally would be spilled to remain in the reservoir for some period of time. That water that sits on top of our water, that space is for drought or for flood protection. With the current situation as far as the flood threat, the Corps is working with us to leave a little extra water in above on our water, and we've been drawing on that, kind of free water, if you will. But we're in really good shape with Cheney as far as the levels there.
As far as new water sources, I saw in the release that El Dorado is considered. Does that come with a cost to the city and then ultimately the taxpayer? I mean, what are the options there?
Yeah, there are really two main options with El Dorado being a player. One is to take raw water from the reservoir and bring it across to our ASR treatment facilities and the well field up north, treat it and put it into the ground for later use, and also be able to send it to town. That's one option. We would be looking at having to build the infrastructure, presumably, under that option. There is a fairly significant rate impact on the water and sewer customers to build that. A lot of it's driven by the very high capital costs associated with building that project. The other option that's available to us with El Dorado is for them to construct a water treatment plant. They're looking at building a new water treatment plant anyway, building some extra capacity at that water treatment plant, and they would be looking at constructing a pipeline over to the city and delivering treated drinking water ready to connect into our system, and that would be based on an amount per gallon or an upfront capital cost that the city would contribute. Both of those have a rate impact, but not as high as some of the other options that we'll be presenting. So those are two possible El Dorado options that we will be bringing as the final 9 that were on our list.
So with those 9 proposals or 9 options, each of them have a price tag to the rate to the consumer. But you guys, is there a favorable one than the other, or is it basically whatever the council decides in terms of what's best for the city?
It's the latter. There's trade-offs. When you have the more expensive a project, generally, the higher the capital costs. Sometimes even the operating costs go way up, but you get more water from that option, a higher yield. And what that means is that you have a lower risk of not being able to get through on a drought. The less expensive options have the less impact on future rates, but they also generally have lower yields associated with them, and it's trickier to be able to get through the drought. Let's not forget that this is not a problem that's solved only by a new water source. You'd want to partner up your efforts with your new water source with conservation so that you matched both. And some of the amounts of conservation on the low yield projects are such significant ongoing conservation targets that, and one in particular, we wonder if it's even possible to achieve that sort of a result. Others, there's one that's very expensive that requires no conservation. It's a pure water supply option to consider. And here's the other part about conservation. Some of the conservation measures are fairly well understood, and so we could actually have a plan that matched the new water source. Some have quite a range of possibility, and so we'll be talking to council and asking permission to do some pilot studies and a couple of consulting engagements to better understand what the costs and benefits of those types of conservation would be.
Is an option also, or being considered, water reuse? I know we're all, the adage is we're drinking somebody else's water and somebody's drinking our water, our sewage water, our flushed water, boiled water. Are we looking at places like California that use water repurposing and reuse?
That was among the very big list of options that we looked at, and actually made it to that list, that final list of 9. 2 different kinds. One would be to treat sewer effluent and send it up to ASR for putting it into the ground so they could be released later on. It'd have to be brought to better than drinking water standards. Another option would be to drill wells along the river bank downstream from the treatment plant, knowing that groundwater that we'd be pulling out is affected by flows in the river, and that part of that flow is sewer effluent from our treatment plant. It's an indirect way of using sewer effluent, but it's filtered by nature through the ground. Don't know if either of those are going to be considerations that council are going to want to look at in more depth, but we are at least bringing the costs and yields associated with those options to them for their consideration.
I think most people would be gun shy if thinking I'm drinking treated sewer water, but obviously that water is filtered, that water has been treated. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that kind of water that's being repurposed, right?
Well, you can. The technology is there to bring it to better than drinking water standards. The perception by the public on whether that's something they would want to do, that is a consideration of those options, of whether they're something that the council wants to consider.
Alan, how difficult was it for you and your staff to balance the need to conserve the price tags of these options, given what you learned in the conservation efforts during your draft?
It was a considerable effort. We don't want to just throw out, hey, conservation's something that we need to do. We wanted to actually look at what kind of conservation would be necessary to support these different new water supply options, so that they could be used to get you through a 1% drought, the lower risk option, the lower risk scenario. What we're trying to do is to also select that type of conservation that we consider to be economically favorable conservation. If, for example, if you start at your demand right now and you reduce future demand, that's a good kind of conservation. Particularly if you can reduce that future demand in such a way that a less expensive new water option complemented with that effort gets you through the 1% drought to 2060. There are some types of conservation which aren't as economically favorable. So, for example, if we wanted to not add any new water supply at all and only accomplish getting through a 1% drought with water conservation, that would mean that we'd have to lower our present demand, and once you lower demand, you've now lost revenue. And for an option, for example, to survive a 1% drought only through conservation and no new water source, you're looking at something more than $1 billion in lost revenue over the planning period. So it's important that you pick the right kind of conservation, understand it, match it to the kind of new water supply options that you're considering, and then also look at the risk associated with being able to achieve those results. Some of the lower yield results, you have to have so much conservation that we look at it and think, is that even possible? And that's one of the things we want to communicate in our presentation to council, that there's risk not only from the drought, but not being able to achieve your objectives through your conservation program. And that's one of the reasons why we're going to ask council to do that, we can do some additional pilot and study work on conservation options.
What's the timeline now for, once you're beyond the workshop, what's the timeline for getting this plan in place and moving forward?
Well, a lot of that that's driven by council. We're providing them with some information that we believe will be helpful for them to consider. This is a complicated set of decisions that obviously that would have to be made. They may provide us with some direction. They may send us back to do some additional homework, to give them some additional information to help them understand the implications of the different options that are under consideration by them. Then there's always the question about how is this to be funded, and how is this going to fold into the current budget process, looking at capital improvement spending, and our ability to sell bonds and the like. So I don't have an answer for when that is. It's going to be driven by council and their decision, what they're going to need to be able to make their decision on this.
Now, can you clarify that tomorrow is a workshop? It's not the meeting in which council will be taking action on?
Yeah, that's a good point. Although the meeting tomorrow is a regular meeting where decisions are made and actions taken, they'll adjourn that regular meeting and convene a workshop, which is what we're talking about presenting at. And there will be no decisions made, just information gathered, presented by staff, and questions and direction given by council on further information that they may need.
Can you expand upon what you guys planned for before, prior to the drought? Was there a plan in place regarding droughts, or did you guys kind of have to start anew?
No, there was an integrated local water supply plan, and it did take into consideration demands and water supplies and droughts, much the very same sorts of things we're talking about now. What we're talking about is an update of that information with the newer assumptions, the newer information that's available to us, and it's appropriate to have a water plan and to update it regularly. It's about time for us to do that update.
Any programs are implemented prior past years that have shown success to where we are today? I mean, is there anything that was that the city had done 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 2 years ago that sort of reaffirm some of the options that were given back then to today?
Well, if you want to go back far enough, building Cheney Lake was an absolute brilliant project that has served the city very well. Development of the well field up north in the Equus beds, that was a brilliant decision that we're benefiting from today. More recently, some of the conservation measures that have been put in place, although not planned in kind of exactly the same sort of way we're talking about, have shown real benefit. When you look at the gallons per capita use of the city, it's one of the leading cities as far as low water amounts per capita. Now, probably a lot of that's not so much driven by people using less water in their homes, although the new standards for low flush toilets and the like help that, just people replacing with fixtures with newer fixtures. But a lot of it we found has to do with irrigation wells being drilled, particularly on the west side of town, and instead of people watering their lawns with drinking water, they're watering lawns with that shallow, low quality water. It's in an aquifer that doesn't compete with the city's use. It's an entirely different aquifer than what we're using. And people have been spending their own money, making their own private investments and putting in those wells. And that's really helped as far as keeping our per capita, gallons per capita number down.